Hmm.
So I'm very optimistic. Don't ask me to pick a winner. I think this is,
Sure.
I don't know,
Yeah.
but there's a market. There's a market.
Hmm.
Cars
Yeah.
and slow trains are not the final answer, I think.
From Earhart Innovation Series, this is What Follows with Nate Thuli.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to What Follows, the podcast where we explore the people shaping aviation today and the ideas defining what comes next. I'm your host, Nate Thuli. I'm really excited to have on the show today Peter Manice, aviation entrepreneur, regional mobility expert, and one of the people helping rethink what air travel can look like in the modern era. Peter is the co-founder and executive vice president of Tailwind Air, which was the first scheduled FAA Part 135 commuter seaplane service connecting Manhattan's East River to the Boston Harbor and Washington, D.C., among other destinations on the eastern seaboard. In this episode, we're going to talk about operating a seaplane commuter service in New York, the realities of regional air mobility, infrastructure challenges, next-generation aircraft, and really unpack the future of what flying might actually look like. Let's get into it. All right, Peter, thanks for being on the show. Welcome.
Thanks, Nate, for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you on. So I want to talk about future of aviation and mobility and regional travel. I know that that's a world you've really put a lot into. But before we get there, can we start with your personal story? How'd you get into aviation?
I mean, it probably goes back to when I was a kid. I think I've always been fascinated by aviation. I was fortunate enough to travel a little bit with my family here and there. I remember going to JFK, the old TWA terminal with those tunnels. I think I've always been more interested as much in the logistics around aviation rather
Oh,
than
interesting.
flying itself. Although I am a pilot in training, as always, I've picked up and put it down. But I think the complication of running a full-on scheduled airline and all of the things behind it has always been very interesting to me.
Interesting. Yeah, you don't hear a lot of. Often you hear the narrative of, oh, it's the lure of beauty, it's this freedom and all that. But you're kind of drawn to the logistics side of it, which is a
I
many to
am,
many
and
complex
the
problem. You
financial
know.
side. After my MBA, I went and worked at American Airlines for a couple of years, and I was in revenue management, which is, if you're not into revenue management, it's pretty, it's revenue management. You're just trying to yield up pricing and all your different strategies, and
Yeah.
it's a lot of math and stats and some intuition, and I loved it. That really got me properly excited. I realized I really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
So
That's
that's
cool.
kind of,
And what I find fascinating about that too is a lot of aviation is a combination of physics kind of running up against the limitations of finance and accessibility and complication, right? And it's kind of like it's not only from a physics perspective just fascinating what these planes can do, but from an economics perspective, there are breakpoints, right? Where, amount of time you're flying and the number of people you have on board and all that kind of stuff can be supportive of the physics of it, but also could be at odds, and so that's a fascinating part of what makes aviation possible.
I agree. I agree. And so it's interesting to see all that combination, and you've got all the practicalities of and all the complications of actually flying people safely from A to B. But then running a business in the background is no easy task, as obviously the short history of commercial aviation shows.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a good point. That's a really good point. And of all industries, those that are, high dollar, high operating cost, a lot of pressure on the financial side for sure. So despite all of that, or I guess in the midst of all of that, you looked at the Eastern Seaboard specifically and went, hey, there could be something there, right? A seaplane service. Can you walk us through that a little bit? How did that come to be?
So I was not the originator of Tailwind Air. It was actually a colleague of mine from my MBA program, and this was multiple years after we graduated. Was frustrated. He lived in D.C., but had a lot of family and work up in New York. Found the entire experience commuting between New York and D.C., as anyone who's done it, is frustrating. This country does not invest or execute on high-speed trains, which would really be the ideal solution. Airlines, especially in a post 9/11 world, it's just not quite the same. The old shuttle product, which was relatively easy to use, that traditional one with the every half hour and just kind of show up and get on, airlines kind of abandoned that. So the founder of the company, Alan Ram, was looking to see if there was a better way to do it. And of course, focused on seaplanes. If you live in New York, as I do, you've seen these seaplanes that come in and out of New York. If you live near the East River, you look up on the East River, you'll see planes, especially in the summer, go in and out of what's called the fishbowl down there between the 59th Street Bridge and the Brooklyn Manhattan Williamsburg Bridge. Sorry. BMW is the way to remember that, by the way.
Perfect.
And I guess put two and two together and said, why can't we run these down to DC? And then of course, the extension of that is, of course, Boston. And the focus of the company became Boston because the train's a little slower and the demand is a little bit greater for something that would be faster.
Wow. How much faster? What type of transit time are you talking about then? Because I'm trying to wrap my head around what even the terminal experience is like.
Here's Penn Station to Boston South Station, the fastest Acela, I think, is 3 hours and 47 minutes, give or take, right? So it's basically 4 hours. So you're looking at trains, nice. Maybe it's a 5-hour transit time from downtown to downtown because you need to factor some time before and after. Plane certainly is faster when everything works, but it can take you an hour to get to LaGuardia. It's another hour and a half en route, even though the air time is only about 35 minutes on those planes. The congestion at LaGuardia and Logan forced that to be about an hour and a half block time almost. And then you're talking about all the other stuff with airplanes and getting to and from the airport and TSA.
Yeah, the amount of time it just takes to board a plane.
Yeah, I mean, everyone's familiar with
right?
that, right? Yeah. So seaplanes are different. We would leave from 23rd Street on the East River. The flight in the air is longer because seaplanes are flying lower and not as fast. So the flight time was about an hour and 15 minutes. Because there's no TSA or terminal or congestion, our check-in cutoff was 15 minutes before the flight. And so you're looking at total journey time from downtown to downtown of well under 2 hours.
I mean, you cut it in half, and
on average,
that's time travel.
Save customers about 90 minutes in each direction. So that's 3 hours round trip, a lot of day trips, a lot of overnights up there. That's real savings. That saves you potentially even on a hotel if you do it during the daytime. So it's pretty game changing, especially for that high frequency commuter.
And that's the part that, you hear a lot in aviation of a plane is, this sort of time machine, right? You get time back. And especially when you're looking at the associated costs, you mentioned, hotel or ground transportation or just the time you get back and what you could be doing with that time, orders of magnitude, especially if you're doing that often, it's not a, hey, here's our once a summer trip over here. This is something you're doing frequently. You're getting meaningful time back constantly. And I think that's the bigger vision of a lot of this kind of urban air mobility, right? Is let's look at this vertical space and let's look at this geographical constraint on airports, especially in busy areas. But let's get creative. Let's think outside the box, right, on how we can solve some of that.
I mean, everyone's very familiar. How hard is it to open up a new airport in the United States? I mean, I think the number of new airports that have opened in the United States can be counted on one hand in the last 30 or 40 years. And major airports, I think it's just one. I can only think of Denver. I may be wrong. There could be one or two others, but it's just a very difficult thing. So one way to look outside the box is to see, well, where else are there runways? Where else could we make space? Water is certainly an option, right? Planes don't need runways. There's a lot of airspace and waterways that are not being used at certain altitudes and in certain spots. You see this next generation. It's kind of near term now. It used to always take a little longer range, but there may be, eVTOLs and some of these new aircraft types that are coming into play that may be operational by the end of this year, subject to some additional FAA certification that it seems to be on track. I saw the other day, I was actually able to witness one of the Joby aircraft landing in the Wall Street helipad.
Very cool.
And that was fascinating.
Yeah.
Interesting to watch.
Yeah. And especially, I know right now, energy density of stored energy in a battery is still limiting range, right? So that again, this is kind of where a lot of modernizing aviation is sort of a combination of what's holding us back. Is it the business side or is it the physics side? And it's sort of keeping those flowing. And I think, what we're seeing right now is that the demand signals are there. The state of tech is nearly there where we are kind of constrained on range, but what a fascinating part of aviation that's opening up.
I come at that whole space with a business hat on. I'm not an engineer. I can't tell you, why an eVTOL works. I mean, I on a conceptual level, I understand it, of course. I do this first generation coming out, interesting how that's going to develop at a business level. I almost wait for almost the next generation. I find some of the aircraft look a little small to commercialize,
Yeah, yeah.
but it's amazing. I mean, there is going to be this generation. Maybe it's in 5 years, maybe 10 years, where you've got some really revolutionary ways to transport people from A to B. And especially regionally, I'm thinking sub 200s, 300 miles, even shorter than that. Things that currently are complicated and difficult with the legacy systems that we have, or expensive to invest in, such as high-speed train travel, might actually be accomplished quite effectively with all these new aircraft coming out.
Yeah. And that's one thing we look at a lot. And so, here at Earhart, we're based out of Los Angeles, and LA, like New York, has a constrained ground transportation in terms of what type of land is available. And unlike New York, no train, right? Nothing underground anyway, and just not this massive network that has been built out there. And you look at how do you connect 2 points without having the land available, right? It'd be one thing if you're putting some kind of a mega highway or a train system across, the rural Midwest where you've got a lot of open land. But, that's where you do need to get creative. And so I applaud the avenue of allocating water as a port for that, as a hub for that. That had to have taken some regional, some governmental, some state kind of involvement, right? What's that like? And from an outside perspective of someone who doesn't know what it takes to do that.
Sure. Well, look, we started on the New York end. The New York end already had an existing seaplane base. Boston did
Great.
not.
Okay.
And the Potomac River, which we would really like to land in, is complicated in its own right for obvious reasons, given where it's located near the Pentagon and the White House and all that stuff. So we thought the easier hill to climb might be in Boston. It certainly took a long time. It was almost a 3-year regulatory effort, culminating with essentially opening up a new airport in Boston. I mean, it's a virtual, but in FAA kind of language, it's essentially a new airport right in the harbor underneath Logan Airport.
Wow.
It took a lot of partnerships, a lot of efforts with local politicians, local communities, but also an alphabet soup of local and federal agencies to actually allow for it to happen. But the due diligence was done, and it happened. It was pretty amazing when it did. We were overjoyed. So there's that side. Regulation is a big factor, obviously, in aviation. There's a lot of good reasons for much of the regulation. There's also, there's a lot of things also that can hurt an operation too, right? For many years, we tried to get, for example, jet fuel into the New York seaplane base. The fact that we didn't have that, did limit a little bit some of the and created additional costs to us.
Yeah.
So you've got that. So it's a mix. So you certainly need to cross all your I's and T's and dot your I's
Yeah.
before you undertake something like this.
Yeah, no, for sure. And to your point, it's about understanding what business that can be, because if you put all of this effort in motion and the end state of what that point to pain is that you're solving isn't there, not from a viable business perspective, it's a little bit in vain, and it's a big undertaking.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm curious, certainly you've had testimonials, customer feedback, what type of, because one thing that we're talking about a fair amount is how to not only make aviation safer, but in a very real way, making it more accessible for people, making aviation an accessible pathway for those that want that option, right? And we think about a road trip a fair amount of, hey, you want to head out to, Palm Springs or Mammoth or Vegas, that's often a road trip type of destination, and hub to hub, a lot of constraints, but there's a general aviation opportunity that people could have available to them if the decision to go, I should be thinking about air travel as a thing, right? And so from a customer experience perspective, you had a bit of a first mover disadvantage in the fact that you had to kind of educate the consumer a little bit on, hey, it's not just cars or trains, and it's not just hub to hub commercial. There is a viable option. What was that customer journey like?
Well, I'll tell you, we're two of the, Boston and New York being two of the larger media markets in the United States. And generally aviation, especially things that are scheduled or relevant to a broader audience, we did get a lot of earned media.
Yeah,
We
cool.
did manage. I remember the day we launched in Boston, there were news helicopters following our seaplane coming in.
No kidding.
Uh,
That's
it's a
cool.
visual thing with airplanes operating so close to the downtown. People were like, "Well, what's that plane doing there?" Right? It wasn't there yesterday. I've never seen a plane take off from Boston before on the water. We certainly got some exposure that way, but actually selling the product and what we were trying to deliver is more challenging. For example, the basic stuff. You go to Google Flights, and we couldn't get our flights onto Google
Jeez.
Flights,
Yeah.
not because of anything, but that Google and the GDSs behind Google didn't have an airport code for our base. And even if they did, it wasn't included as part of the Metro Boston. So if you were searching Boston to New York, our results wouldn't come up. So then you're looking at pushing, you're kind of paddling upstream the entire time. Word of mouth, customer testimonials, partnerships with other demand sources, tapping into both paid but especially earned media. We're really critical to our passengers and and a lot of repeat passengers. Ultimately, our customer was a high frequency commuter going down 2-3 times a month, for all kinds of reasons. That was very attractive.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And
And
then
it
you're
was a
not putting.
premium product, right? It was a premium product placed, at the, about 1.5 to 2 times the walk-up fare. So you'd have to communicate the time value of money proposition that you're proposing. It attracted a higher end, both leisure, but especially business commuter.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And when you're using it for business and aviation in general, I think when you can tie a business use to how you're approaching aviation, it streamlines a lot of the economics a fair amount. You can really kind of connect the dots on what that time value of money really is. Would you say so as you're looking at modern air mobility solutions coming into the world, customer skepticism, public acceptance, kind of this, is this the way I want to be doing it? It's out of their comfort zone a little bit. How did you approach that? Did you have anyone, because you were flying, it's a Cessna Caravan I saw, right? Is that right?
Yep. Yep.
And so I think people are maybe not as familiar with seeing that size of an aircraft, and outside of African
Right.
safari or up in Alaska, how did that customer, I guess, skepticism and acceptance part?
I mean,
play
that
into
was
this?
part of the message. The Cessna Caravan is a modern turboprop. It's not even a propeller. It's not even a traditional. Most people don't even go to that level, but obviously turbines are more reliable. Seaplanes can land both. These were amphibs, so in other
Cool.
words, they had both
They had
wheels
and
and
floats.
floats. So they
Yeah.
had the option of landing on a runway or in the water. That being said, you can't provide a full education. You don't get that amount of time in front of a potential customer. Some people were just not going to go for it, and that's okay. I mean, we picked 2 markets with millions of people traveling between them annually. And so really you just need to convert the people who value what you're doing. We were, FAA Part 135 compliant. So, very high level of oversight and training, and our pilots and our safety management system and all those things were kind of fully compliant and often exceeded any kind of standard that existed. But you can't convert everybody. Not everyone's going to get on a small plane. I mean, just
Yeah.
like not everyone's going to get on a helicopter or one of these new like big drones with people in them.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that's we were talking at the beginning, these kind of eVTOL.
Or they're like, I'll wait.
planes.
Oh, you go first.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, like do I have to hold the camera in this camera drone that I'm apparently sitting in now, or how does that dynamic work? The first mover disadvantage, I guess, the education imperative that comes with that. And you bring up a good point. You don't necessarily have that much time with the customer to have that conversation. A lot of this has to be presented at face value of here's what it is, and here are the 3 things that you're going to need to care about, and would love more time to talk to you about it.
Well,
But that's maybe all you
driving
get.
home time, convenience, comfort, city to city. We actually attracted more trained customers in our own internal surveys than we did people away from the traditional airlines. So it's funny, there are people who really valued not having to go to the airport and all of that.
Yeah.
Nonsense that comes with
Yeah.
it, whether it be
Yeah.
the friction, bridge and tunnel friction, from the journey to the airport, or whether it be what's going on at the airport itself, and all the other things.
Yeah.
So about 65% of our customers were trained travelers. So they just didn't want to leave the city. And that's what the seaplane empowered you to do.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, and despite tens of millions, hundreds of millions going into airport modernization and ops efficiency initiatives, really trying to streamline that. It, so on the personal front, when we travel commercially, we try to do the right, ground transit, the right check-in experience, all the little things we can try to tweak to really drive down the barriers to traveling that way. And one use case we have just personally is here in Los Angeles, go visit family in Colorado a fair amount. And I've gotten into the habit of timing it from the time I lock the front door and we leave the house till we walk in the front door. The fastest record-setting time we've ever had is 9 hours. And then did that one time in a small plane, and door to door, it was just over 4.5 hours. And so you get all that time back, right? And so if you kind of pull the thread forward, and it's a compounding thing, right? As we put less of a strain on hub-to-hub commercial travel, that transit experience can be better, and we can kind of take that burden and put it out on a larger ecosystem. If you were to kind of forecast into the future, what do you think, 5-10 years from now, the advanced mobility air travel opportunities might look like? Where do you see, or I guess, where would you want it to be? What would
there are a
excite
lot
you?
of people spending a lot of time on this, right? Including, large publicly traded companies at this point. The opportunity is enormous, right? Whether it be transporting people, human organs, whether at your delivery boxes, there's a lot of defense applications to all of this. That being said, regional mobility is something that essentially Part 121 traditional airlines are anything under 300 or 400 miles are largely basically ignoring or not serving anymore. There's some obvious exceptions to all of that, especially where there's like a body of water in the way or something like that. But, there are a lot of companies working. I was talking the other day about Regent, the Sea Glider. I don't know if your listeners are familiar with that. They're building a sea glider that's going to use, it's not really a glider, so it's interesting they call it a sea glider. It uses wing and ground effect. So, when the airplane lands, and at the very end, it floats right before it lands. So you kind of feel it. It kind of floats there. It's an aircraft that's designed to operate 30 to 50 feet off the water.
Right in ground effect the whole time.
And it's in ground effect, so it's actually certified as a boat, surprisingly. But look, that's a fascinating idea. I mean, think about the Caribbean or the Hawaiian Islands or anything with a ferry service, right? Anything with water in between that's either being covered by a very fast airplane, but that's not going very far. So it's kind of like a lot of horsepower for nothing, or maybe a fast ferry, but that's limited at 30, 50 miles an hour, maybe. So, that's an interesting thing. I love the couple companies that are working on these blown wing designs that are going to be able to take off in 150, 200 feet. That opens up football fields, parking lots, potentially, the sidelines of an airport that may already be at saturation, right? We wouldn't have to use the regular runway. We'd just use this, piece of tarmac, maybe where the helicopters land, or some other part of the field. And that would all of a sudden allow an entire new category of lift to come in and customers to be served. Vertiports, seaplanes, next generation seaplanes, seaplanes largely, really no new seaplane designs, certified seaplane designs have really come into effect since, I don't know, probably like the late 70s, maybe early 80s. A clean sheet, maybe a hybrid electric. There's a lot of things that could drive down costs, drive down the unit cost of flying one person 1 mile in regional transportation. Electrification, the simplicity of electric engines, and the lack of, just so many fewer moving parts. I mean, once you've got that thing really nailed down and conforming and certified and all of that stuff, it promises potentially to open up aviation and regional aviation in particular, really to the masses, because the cost of executing those kinds of things is going to go way down. So I'm very optimistic. Don't ask me to pick a winner. I think this is, I don't know.
Yeah.
But there's a market. There's a market. Cars and slow trains are not the final answer, I think.
No. It's especially when you look at all the space available. And the part that I keep thinking while you're explaining this too is, you think, hey, regional travel, let's look at bodies of water, let's look at seaplanes. And the part that I find so ironic about that is that shouldn't be an alarming idea when we're talking about Earth. the blue planet, right? 70+% of our surface is water. What a tremendous amount of available space to work with.
And specifically water. I mean, most large cities are near water for all kinds of good reasons, historically and presently. So there typically is some kind of water access to most major metropolitan areas.
Yeah, and why not use it, right? Although I guess the surface conditions can get a little bit squirrely. You don't necessarily get a clean, smooth water surface every time you want to land on it. It gets a little more
Sure,
dynamic.
it's a challenge. There are limits to seaplanes, right? Seaplanes cannot operate in fog, right? Runways are effectively sterile areas, right? They have a fence around them. There really shouldn't be people or things. It's a controlled environment.
Mhm.
Waterways are not. So there are some limitations, but a lot of those things can be dealt with, some of these new things also. I mean, technology can solve some of that. New systems can solve that. New designs can solve some of that. It's interesting.
Yeah. Well, so I want to pull back the thread a little bit to something you brought up at the beginning of the call. Pilot in training, on and off. Can you elaborate a little bit? So you've had your own journey learning to fly, and I'm kind of curious on how that's gone. In particular, when we look at the number of even just Americans that have a driver's license compared to those that have a pilot's license, you're already in the single digit percentages. I think it's, greater than 50% aren't even able to then finish. It's very difficult, right? The numbers get astronomically small for any number of reasons. I'm kind of curious on how that journey's been for you.
Well, first of all, let me say in the United States, we're very lucky. I have some familiarity. I mean, I think the percentage of Americans who actually are licensed pilots is higher on the population level than almost any other country. We have a very active and robust general aviation system that is very egalitarian and is really a comparatively low barrier to entry. I mean, I encourage everyone who has any inkling about flying or wanting to fly. It's fantastic. My own journey is a short story. I've always been interested in flying, but again, focused a lot on the business of flying. I did get an opportunity about 10 years ago to go down to Florida and kind of take a crash course, a kind of intensive thing. I have about 65 hours. I know how to land. I've soloed. I've done a bunch of stuff. My youngest child was actually born right as I was going to pass the flying test, and I got a little sidelined. I went back to New York because that's where I live. New York's a
Okay.
complicated place to fly out of. Not so much the airspace, but it's just took up a lot of time. I was really in Manhattan, and the nearest airport is an hour away, and then you had to, it just turned
Yeah.
into something that I couldn't do at the time. And then, of course, I got rusty. And then I'm like, well, I'll get back to this at some point. So the good news, Nate, is I'm finally back to it. I'm starting to take some flight lessons again. So
Excellent.
in short order, I should actually be licensed. But I
love
feel
that.
dangerous. So I'm fortunate to have one or two friends who have some little airplanes, and I sit in the right seat, and
Yeah.
I think I know what I'm doing.
Yeah, airplanes are very good at pointing out the gap in our knowledge, when we get up there, and
It's still complicated. It's very complicated, and I think also technology here is going to improve this, right? Obviously, digital flight displays and all the things and the improvements in GPS, and you can basically fly your airplane from your iPad at this point, at least from a navigation perspective. But then there's some very arcane parts to our system. You've got all the radio calls, the complicated airspace. You need a high degree of situational awareness. Binary outcomes. You really do not, you don't want to mess up, right? There's just a lot to keep in mind. Spacing is essentially manually done, right, between
yeah,
people on a radio that
yeah,
none of us even use anymore. I mean,
yeah.
like, no, who talks on two-way radios?
Right. Dialing into a frequency to do it, it makes
Outside
sure
of
your
aviation
frequency.
and maybe some maritime stuff, but really, and everyone's being kept apart and safe by two people talking in some kind of coded language that they understand, but and actually is very clear. But it's still a very arcane way to do things in a way. I would imagine we'll move past that to a large degree at some point. I know that so quote unquote they're working on it.
Right. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
that can be a dissuader too, right? Just it's a lot of things to keep in mind, and then staying fresh, right? The threat was, and this happens to a lot of pilots. Yes, could I pass the test? I'm sure.
Mhm.
Would I have the proficiency to go out there on a routine basis 2-3 times a month? Fly around the pattern, be safe enough to want to fly my family somewhere. There's a difference.
Yeah.
And it's a journey, and I'm continuing it. I'm optimistic.
I love that. Well, and I want to call out something you said too. This personal limitation awareness that you have. That's crucial, because you could get a certificate that says you're allowed to do a thing, and you could even pass the mandatory kind of prescripted numbers of takeoff and landings and the reviews that you need to do. But there's still a difference between that and, hey, this flight I'm about to do, am I really proficient on that? Am I really ready for that? And it takes a synthesis of a lot of information that, from a regulatory standpoint, there's a lot that's prescribed already, and that's supposed to at least raise the barrier to entry high enough that we're making informed decisions. And I love that you've pulled that thread even further of let me actually walk through the flight I'm thinking about doing right now, and some laps in the pad, or maybe flying with my family, and under the total context for all of that, is it a smart decision to say yes to this? And we need more of that. We need more of that kind of informed decision making. That's what makes it.
I have a number of pilot friends who face that all the time. It's interesting. It's tough sometimes to pull the plug on a flight, right? Get-theritis is a real thing, and it's a real disease. It's unfortunately it's killed a lot of people over the years. It's very difficult to know when you're getting in beyond what you're capable of doing. So I think it's great. There's a lot of information in podcasts and on social media and YouTube formats. Especially, I think that a lot of the pilot community probably has a much higher awareness of the types of mistakes and situations that people have gotten themselves involved with that are a nice reminder kind of to, I think there's a lot of tools out there now that hopefully, I think on the whole, good decisions are being made.
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah. You mentioned getting your MBA, and I remember, getting my MBA in grad school as well. Case studies, right? Case studies are a big part of that. It's kind of like, hey, if you're going to set out and understand how to run a company, let's look at some of these big stories of what companies have gone through and pitfalls that are maybe easier to see. 2020 vision of hindsight. Let's use that case study analysis. And to your point, there is a large number of content available now on, the debriefs of incidents. What can we learn, right? Which these are real case studies.
That's amazing. They used to be really just in kind of like, a stack of kind of FAA dockets, right? You really had to be highly motivated and also understand the way they speak and what they're talking about. There are a number of people out there who are really bringing these stories kind of to life, and I think really targeted at other pilots, and they go through it in a way that I think is very understandable. Look, I don't want to pretend that I'm a fly. I'm very actively involved in flying. I was also impressed, safety, modern safety management systems. The tools that our pilots who were flying our dispatch flights go out there to risk assess everything and take away, it's an interesting funnel. There's been so many improvements on all of that. The U.S. airspace system has its challenges, and of course, even the smallest ones make broad headlines across the world. But it's kind of shocking how actually safe it really is, in spite of the data technology, in spite of a lack of investment, or actually more of a lack of ability to execute on that investment.
Sure.
In better air traffic control systems. The fact is, modern aviation is really a marvel of humanity.
Yeah.
I mean, you really think about the billions and billions of travelers and what they actually do on a daily basis. It's pretty amazing.
It's extraordinary. And I know there were times not that long ago that there will never be a plane that can cross the Atlantic Ocean, and that'll be a ship journey. And now here we are. We're not only doing that constantly, but
10 years ago, there'll never be an electric aircraft. I saw one flying a person. Yes. Last week, it was a Joby aircraft. It was using the heliport in Wall Street. They were doing a demonstration flight, didn't have actually paying passengers on it. That being said, this plane transitioned from a helicopter, like an Osprey, to just turn into a plane and was going to fly over to JFK. I remember when we thought that was not going to happen. Oh, the battery's too heavy, or you're not going to get that weight power ratio and all that stuff. The fact is,
here we are.
We can do stuff. We can do things.
Yeah, I love it.
I'm waiting for something a little bit bigger, a little meatier. I think that The business side of me wants something a little bigger and meatier.
Yeah, and then
but it
there's
doesn't
more of
matter.
a business case to be had with that, right? There's
Yeah,
more
yeah,
trade
yeah.
space to work with. So you kind of read my mind into really the last question I had for you today, which was, we've been talking about kind of advancing mobility and modern air travel and kind of what the future of that looks like. And you've, I think you said it very well of you have been very active in the world of aviation, and active in the regard that you've been doing this. And I'm curious, the question I had for you was, has there been a moment when you've kind of had this sink in of like, we are living what is this future vision of aviation? Like we're living a piece of it right now. This is the future of aviation happening right now. And I had the question in mind more from the seaplane perspective, but maybe it was watching that Joby aircraft flight. I'm kind of curious. Is there something that jumps out of, wow, this is we're going to be seeing more of,
I mean, and I don't know what's familiar to everyone who's listening to this and what's not. I mean, I've been involved with a lot of and aware of a lot of these new aircraft designs that are coming out. So, yes, there are going to be new forms of flight. I think that the vertical, what they call the VTOL market, with the vertical takeoff, and then it flies like a fixed wing aircraft. I think that's a fascinating development. That opens up a lot of things. A lot of limitations to that right now, right? I mean, the infrastructure that's needed on both sides, right? This is not going to be a helicopter, at least in the beginning, because it can't land anywhere, because if it needs more juice, it's going to need to have the infrastructure that we already have, for aircraft.
Mm-hmm.
And so there'll be limitations to that. There's some hybrid electric aircraft. Think for commercial purposes, I've always felt, and this is more from my revenue management and trying to sell butts and seats, I've always thought an aircraft really needs to have 8 or 9 passengers at a minimum to really be good for passenger service. That has a lot to do with it's just 4 or 5 passengers. It's a difficult aircraft to kind of fill.
The physics has just not caught up
Selling
to the
individual seats.
Economics of it.
If you're missing 2 people, right? Well, how do you make money, right? Or you have to price it so that if it's only half full, you're going to make money, but then it gets very expensive. I think I'm waiting for what I see as the first generation of these certified electric aircraft to get a little larger. I think that that's when perhaps the everyday benefits of regional mobility are going to become a little bit more accessible and a little more generally relevant to a lot of people. I think it'll be a little more niche in the beginning. There are going to be constraints on the infrastructure available for only electric.
Mm-hmm.
I think actually a hybrid route seems to make a little more sense, where you've got maybe a way of recharging those batteries on board your aircraft. But look, I think it's very promising, and I think seaplanes investing in a clean sheet, hybrid electric seaplane makes an enormous amount of sense. I think there's always going to be a role for those, and I look forward to that. I think that could be a big thing too.
Absolutely. I hope we see that come to fruition here pretty soon. That would get me
Commitment
excited.
level. It takes a lot of commitment. What do they say? 10 years ago, they said it cost $1 billion to certify a clean sheet design airplane. That's a lot of money, right? And really, it probably costs even more than that. So it's a lot of delayed gratification if you're the investor.
Yeah.
And so the hurdles are high, but again, what we have now is extremely safe and extremely effective and extremely trusted and extremely is at such a high level that to put a new entrant into that thing does require a high hurdle.
For sure. Yeah, because you're messing with the known thing, right? You're messing with something that is determined. Wow. Well, I've really enjoyed this conversation. I really appreciate your time, and I really appreciate what you're doing for aviation. Before we part, any final thoughts?
Not really, Nate. I've just really enjoyed this conversation. I thought it was interesting. The world is evolving quickly around us in all kinds of levels, but aviation being one of them, especially this particular area.
Absolutely. Well, it'll be interesting to see what we watch unfold over the next year or two. I think we're at an exciting time. So really appreciate it. Thank you again, everyone.
Thank you.